Taha, Alvas, I'd like to start with you first. We heard President Erdogan there describe this as an economic war against Turkey. What does he mean by that?
I think he means that what the United States is trying to do is use its economic clout to get its way in its international perspective, in its politics internationally. And that makes sense because, I mean, ever since following World War II, the United States has had very little success unilaterally in military confrontation. So it's all been economic wars. I mean, the last 50 years, the last 67 years, the Cold War ended because of an economic war against the Soviet Union. So I think that's what he's referring to. I think there are things that the United States wants Turkey to be doing, and it's using its economic clout to do that, and that's what I think he's referring to.
And Mobin, we did see evidence of Trump's interference last week in Turkey, didn't we, when President Trump fired off a tweet that led to this latest shock against the lira. Just take us through what happened there.
Well, the timing of that tweet was quite suspect also. It came right as the finance minister was explaining his plan for the medium-term program for the economy. And of course, we did hear from the president firsthand from his tweet, President Trump, that is, about the doubling of tariffs on Turkish steel and aluminum imports to the United States. So, of course, that did have an impact on the lira, as we saw the currency fell almost immediately following that. And then, of course, there are some of the developments that have been taking place, perhaps not in such a social sphere as Twitter, like the delay in the sale of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. So, of course, all of these things are sort of together creating that uncertainty over the future of Turkey and its relationship with the United States.
Alexander Prosveryakov, Russia, of course, has been on the receiving end of an endless number of sanctions, it seems. I'm wondering if you could explain to us what impact have those sanctions had on the Russian economy, and how has the Russian government responded to them?
Yeah, the first round of sanctions was back in 2014, and this was something new for the Russian market, and the Russian investors were kind of afraid because they didn't know where this would go. And we indeed had a little panic, but during the next the several weeks after the sanctions were announced, as you can see, the Russian economy started basically to go back where it was before the sanctions. And now we had some measures, mostly economic measures, mostly aimed at the financial stability of Russia. We have now approximately $500 billion of reserves of the central bank. Now we're limiting the exposure that we have, so our companies and our state is borrowing less dollars, and we're starting to trade in other currencies with our trading partners. We're starting to avoid dollars where it is possible to do so without causing any harm, and I think we're going to do more and more of this in the next few months and years.
Yeah, so Stephen Seggie, I'd like to turn to you now. It seems that the US has a number of countries in its sights when it comes to these measures. Turkey, Russia, we heard there, Iran, China. What is President Trump trying to do with those countries in particular?
Well, I think he's trying to, as Taha mentioned already, he's trying to really bully these countries into doing things that he wants to do. Of course, that's assuming some sort of great strategic thoughts on his part. He may just be really annoyed at the fact they're not bowing to his will and getting annoyed and then sending the tweet, you know, as Mobin mentioned, at a certain time. Was it deliberate to send it at that time to really, it was really insulting to send a tweet during the minister's speech at that particular time. But he's clearly trying to bully across Twitter people into, or countries into doing what he wants them to do. And I think, you know, Taha mentioned this already, America has a history of engaging in these kind of bullying tactics. What's new today, I think, is that it's done so much in the open. It's very crass. Oftentimes it was done before behind closed doors, using institutions, etc. But now it's been done over Twitter. Now it's been done out in the open, and I think that's new. And the communication style of Trump is quite, I think we all agree, is quite unique as a leader. So, you know, he's trying to bend these countries. And I'd also add, I think, okay, you mentioned those 4 countries, but I think any European country, you know, Merkel has come out today and talked, or last night, and talked about how, you know, it's in nobody's benefit for Turkey to suffer economically. And of course, the European market is very highly tied into the Turkish market. And we saw the fall in the euro in line, not in line, but as a result of what was happening with the Turkish lira. So I think, you know, it wouldn't surprise me if Germany finds herself, you know, being attacked by Trump as well, or the UK. or France or whoever, Macron or any of these people. So I don't think it's necessarily just, those four countries that you mentioned.
And we'll hear from German Chancellor Angela Merkel in a moment. But now I'd like to play a little grab from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who, as you know, has been visiting Ankara. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Settlements in the national currencies in trade with Turkey and other countries have been under discussions for a long time. But the US use of sanctions will undermine the role of dollar as a settlement currency over time. The dollar as the international reserve currency is now misused, and more countries will start to use other currencies and find other partners to rely on.
So that was Sergei Lavrov basically talking about this idea that Trump is using the US dollar as a weapon against certain countries. Can I turn to Alexander Prosvyryakov to get a response on this? Is this the view in Russia? Is Trump using the dollar as a weapon?
Indeed it is, and the people now understand it, and I think this is a broad conception now everywhere, because the only sanctions that really might hurt Russia are the ones where dollar is involved. So now the companies are starting to use more national currencies, like Sergei Lavrov just said, and we see this trend not only in the companies and the corporations and in the state, but also within the people, within the public. The public starts to trust dollars less than they used to trust them before. Usually where panic starts, people before that they bought the dollars. Now they don't. Now they buy euros and diversify with other currencies, and they don't really look at the dollar anymore in Russia. And I think this trend will continue.
Taha, Alvas, now that Turkey seems to be on the receiving end of this weaponization of the dollar, what should Turkey do?
I think it's important not to read too much into what the United States has been doing. I think we may be in the midst of an economic war in general, broadly, for the entire world versus the United States, Europe, etc., as Stephen mentioned a second ago. But as far as Turkey goes, the measures that the United States has used against Turkey and the measures that Turkey has responded with in kind to the United States are very minimal as far as actual tariffs, actual sanctions go. I believe that the moves done by the Trump administration, frankly, and Pence specifically, I mean, it's important to distinguish the two, Trump, Pence, and the United States in general, the government, the bureaucracy, the State Department, et cetera. These are completely different frankly, from the president and the vice president. These are politicians who need to be reelected. Their party is up for election in November. They need a galvanizing issue to be behind, and this is perfect for them. And I think this is what they're using it for. They're using these steps to do it. I mean, there's more sauce than there's meat here. These tariffs won't cripple Turkey, and the Turkish tariffs on the United States won't do the same. So there could have been a lot worse things that the United States could have done, and similarly Turkey could have done. So I think it's important not to read too much into it. But having said that, I think these are political things that will abate after November, I think.
Can I add something here as well? I think also, though, the uncertainty is quite troubling for Turkey. I think because, the US, Trump, I agree with Taha. Trump is playing this as an internal, there's elections coming up, so Trump is using this as a domestic issue. The problem, I think, is as well, though, that Trump, there's a lot of things that he could do in addition, and I think this uncertainty of more sanctions, particularly with talking about Russia and Magnitsky-style sanctions that have been talked about in the Financial Times, that have been talked about in the Wall Street Journal as a possibility. I think this uncertainty creates, real problems for the markets in particular because they don't like this uncertainty. And Trump is a bit of a loose cannon in that regard, and I think that's a problem.
And I think for Turkey's benefit, the trade between Turkey and the United States is not as great as trade between Turkey and the European Union. I mean, Turkey has, if anything, been pushed into the arms of the European Union, Russia, etc. now. I mean, it's been a unique position where the European Union has embraced Turkey, and Turkey has embraced the European Union, maybe involuntarily here, but it has. And so even if there were major repercussions with the United States, Turkey is still fine because the European Union is its neighbor, and things are. I mean, we have a common. Trump is a common
nuisance.
I'm trying to figure out a word here. Not an enemy, but a common adversary here, economically or politically, in the short term. So I think
Can I just, I think Turkey can't change its neighbours. I think, any country has the geographical configuration that it has. And Turkey, whether Turkey at times likes it or doesn't like it, Europe at times likes it or doesn't like it, it has Europe as a neighbour. And I think for a long, long time, Turkey and the EU, and this is not with this government, actually this government has gone from having the best relationships with the EU to some of the worst at times, but, for 40, 50 years, you've had this kind of troubled relationship between the EU and Turkey, and I think you do need some sort of realignment from both sides as to what they really want, what Turkey wants from the EU and what the EU wants from Turkey. But when you look at, when I was teaching here, when I was working here, students would ask about Turkey moving away from the West, and, you'd stick up a slide showing the amount of FDI, where it comes from, 40-odd% of FDI coming from Europe. And even if this is Chinese firms doing FDI through the Netherlands or whatever, it's still the majority coming from Europe. Then after that, we've got America. Even within its tourism, whether it's, any sort of support, it's coming predominantly from Europe. So the EU cannot get rid of Turkey. Turkey cannot get rid of the EU or the European continent, whatever you call it. So I think it's really important that both...
Stephen, sorry to interrupt you,
Sure.
there, but can I turn to Mobin Nassar now, because President Erdogan and the Turkish government have responded to the day's events. Can you just take us through what are some of the changes that the government has announced so far?
Of course, there's a whole list of tariffs, and as we've seen, some of the things being hit: cars, tobacco, alcohol, rice, cosmetics. About $500 million worth of U.S. exports to Turkey. I'd like to just go back to what Taha had just mentioned about, on the face of it, sure, it looks like Turkey and U.S. don't have a whole lot of business, especially if you compare it to the European Union. But this is about 38,000 jobs that we're talking about in the U.S., directly linked with things that are sold to Turkey.
Right.
And if this is not the only country that the U.S. is having these spats with. It's being hit by retaliatory tariffs by a number of countries. China, the list is growing. I wonder at what point does this really start to pinch the U.S. economy? If sectors with 10,000 people here, 30,000 people there, beans, we've had all sorts of different segments of the U.S. workforce being hit from different sides. And of course, given this happy gunslinging nature of the president, really nobody knows who is an ally next week.
Right.
Can they expect tariffs? So for the marginal businessman looking to make deals, I wonder at what point do people around the world really start second guessing whether they want to enter new deals, new partnerships with U.S. providers?
I think what's interesting is the Trump administration's policies are so much in flux on a day-to-day basis. I mean, during the campaign, he talked about currency manipulation with the Chinese and how they were, doing this economic war between the Chinese and the United States. And then he comes out now and he says he's very much in favor of a strong dollar policy. He said a year and a half ago. And now he's saying he wants a weak dollar. And he's attacking the Federal Reserve for increasing interest rates. Yep. And the Federal Reserve have come back and said, if you take fiscal policies to undermine the U.S. dollar, we will take monetary policies to fight you back and prop up the dollar. This will lead to, the U.S. dollar is now at a multi-year high against all currencies. The Turkish Lira today, or recently, has gone up 15% against the dollar. It was at after this initial currency crisis. Now it's come back, in part because the European Union has realized, as Stephen said, that the Turkey and the European Union are so close. We're almost, Turkey and the European Union are married to each other, because Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Spain, Italy have so much exposure to Turkey. The ECB has no choice but to help Turkey out here if it doesn't want 15 little Greek crises. Turkey is 5 times the size of Greece. Greece, messed up the financial markets, ruined financial markets for 2 years. And we're talking about a country, like I said, that's 1/5 of Turkey's size. And recently, as you know, Turkey released these 2 Greek soldiers who had crossed the border into Turkey, involuntarily or by mistake, as they say. And I'm not sure what the Turkish government says about this, and that was an important step in getting close to Europe and saying, okay, we have a common adversary here as far as finances go. And I think that's why the Turkish lira has gained so much against the dollar.
And speaking of the European response, we have heard from German Chancellor Angela Merkel recently, who's weighed into the Turkey situation. So let's just listen to what she had to say about it.
Niemand, aber das sage ich jetzt auch aus Deutschland.
Nobody, and I say this from the German perspective, has an interest in economic destabilization in Turkey. But everything must be done to ensure that an independent central bank can function. We will soon have the opportunity to speak with the Turkish president about these issues. We profit from a stable economic environment around us, around the European Union, and everyone needs to contribute to this. Germany would like to see an economically prosperous Turkey.
So Angela Merkel, of course, has been very critical of President Trump's various trade wars against it and the rest of the world. But those battles have largely been about correcting what Trump sees as a trade imbalance, whereas this battle against Turkey, this economic war, as Erdogan has called it, is about so much more than that, isn't it, Taha? Can you just explain to us, what is Donald Trump trying to do with Turkey?
Like I said previously, I believe he's using Turkey. Turkey is at a position now. I mean, we have this pastor who is being tried rather for aiding and abetting terrorists in the run-up to the the 15th of July coup that happened 2 years ago. So, and this has happened for. I mean, this pastor has been was in prison for almost 2 years, and then the Turkish government let him go, and he is under now house arrest at a seaside resort, seaside place. And then the same day that they released him from prison is when Donald Trump came out with these tweets and with these threats. So that speaks to their position here. It's not about releasing this pastor and getting him, released, etc. It's about politics. And the worst case scenario for Trump is if he gets released, if Brunson gets released tomorrow, that's horrible for Trump. He loses his political card that he was hoping to do. But obviously we know that, I mean, Turkey it'll be almost impossible now for Turkey to do that, because Turkey says, listen, we have a justice system here. These things take time. I mean, it took the United States 4.5 years to convict anyone of the September 11th hijackings. It took literally 4.5 years. 17 years later, we still have people in Guantanamo Bay detained for those crimes, and they have yet to be tried at all. It took 4.5 years for anyone to get convicted for September 11th, and it's taken less than 2 years now for this pastor. So justice moves slow in Turkey, as it does in Italy and other bureaucratic countries in the world. That's true, but not. I mean, what can they do? They say we have to wrap this up, and you're going to have to wait and see what happens. So.
Alexander Prozviryakov, we've talked about the sanctions that the Russian government has been slapped with. Obviously, the US hopes that will affect some sort of a change. We don't know what exactly, but is there any sign from the Russian perspective, from Moscow, that these sanctions will get them to actually do what the US wants them to?
Well, I think they will make the Russians do the opposite, basically, because everybody's fed up with what the US is trying to do. They're very unpredictable, they're unstable. So now we're looking for stable partners, stable currencies, stable assets. This is why Russia sold most of its US Treasury holdings that we held in the central bank reserves. So they have the opposite effect. I don't think that the Trump administration, with this sort of actions, will get closer to their goal, to what they're trying to achieve with imposing such sanctions. So I think they will fail.
Okay, now in terms of the way forward, we've heard Mobin outline some of the measures that Erdogan has announced in response to these new US sanctions and tariffs. But what happens now with this economic war, as Erdogan has called it? Will it continue? Can Turkey continue to thrive in spite of it? Can I just get an opinion from each of you quickly?
Well, I think some of the steps that the central bank has also announced need to be looked at as well. Since May, we've had interest rate hikes of about 4.25%. I think that's significant. It's a return to the single rate instead of the corridor. That's a demand that had been heard from investors and those circles for many years. And now, just today, we've seen the central bank talking about the government's own plans of cutting its expenses, bringing down the fiscal deficit. So I think domestically, those are the steps to take. Whether the timing could be a lot faster or slower, of course, that's a question for the markets to judge. But I think there are a number of steps that are being introduced, both from the fiscal side and on the monetary policy side. I'd defer to you.
I mean, I think what's going to happen here is Trump is going to milk this, like I said, for politics as much as possible. But the central bank did another thing. They put a cap on the amount of liras that you could borrow to short, to sell, to speculate. So the offshore lira, as it were, has vaporized, has disappeared. And this has stopped the decrease of the Turkish lira. It wasn't that Turkish people holders of liras were going and buying dollars, although that did happen. It was that speculators, algorithmic traders, and other people were selling the lira, shorting it, so that it could, because they saw an impending doom for Turkey here without really thinking it out and thinking, well, will the Europeans allow this? Will Turkey's trading partners allow this? And the answer is, of course they won't, because they have too much to lose. And that's why it's come back now. That move immediately stopped the lira's depreciation. It immediately stabilized. So I don't think this will last much longer, frankly. I think the rhetoric will continue on both sides because it's in President Trump's interest, and I think Putin and President Erdogan will do the same and respond to that rhetoric as they must to protect the pride of their countries. But I don't think the economic implications of this war will continue.
Surely the fear and greed aspect of markets was really on display with that volatility. I think we've had multiple bank heads coming out and describing this as speculative attacks rather than economic crisis. So it's really sort of the cart before the horse in this situation, as far as the lira movements at least are concerned.
Absolutely. I think the fall in the ruble the same way. I mean, the ruble fell to multi-level lows right after Turkey. The South African rand was down 10%. In one day, and all these countries, all these emerging markets are realizing, and the world is realizing, if Turkey goes down with this economic war or the financial troubles we're having, it will be a domino effect that will spread throughout the entire world, and we'll have a great recession that makes 2008 look like a walk in the park. So I don't think any investors, and these investors, these banks and these heads of these major investment banks are on the phone to Trump saying, "What are you doing? We don't want to lose our shirt over this." And he's going to have to step back from this, and I think he will.